Today we're going to start talking about the major events that led to the Civil War, and then we're finally going to talk about the Civil War itself. We've been talking about westward expansion and all the sectional differences that emerged. Now we're going to really focus on the specific things that resulted in the bloodiest war in U.S. history. You must first understand how Congress works. Think back to the Great Compromise, where we built our two-house system. You have the Senate based on statehood. Every state gets 2 senators, and the House, where every state gets representatives based on population. With westward expansion and immigration, your northern free states have more people. So the House is dominated by free state representatives. It becomes very important for the South to keep the Senate. So your Senate is always going to be equal, but with immigration, the North is immigration and westward expansion. The North is gaining representatives. The issue of slavery is going to come up again and again as we expand westward, and we're going to end up with something called the Missouri Compromise. And it's going to let Maine enter as a free state and Missouri as a slave state. And it sets the boundary for slavery at the 3630 parallel. So the 3630 parallel is this line right here. It runs directly under Missouri and on top of this Arkansas territory. And what the Missouri Compromise said was anything north of the 3630 parallel would be free, and anything south could still become a slave state. Again, on this issue of slavery, we're going to have the Wilmot Proviso. And the Wilmot Proviso wanted any new territories gained from Mexico to be free states. This is going to see the development of a political party which you need to know, which is the Free Soil Party. The Wilmot Proviso passed the House, of course we talked about, because the House has more northern representatives, more free state representatives, but it can't pass the Senate. But it did sort of reconfirm that it's going to be a fight with every state that asks to be admitted to the Union. Even though we've made the Missouri Compromise, we still have all of this other western territory that we're going to have to fight over. Does it become slave, or does it enter the Union as a slave state, or does it enter the Union as a free state? So, of course, the gold rush leads California to want to be admitted. And California wants to be admitted as a free state. But of course, that's going to, again, upset this balance in Congress. So we are going to end up with another compromise. And this compromise is the Compromise of 1850. It said that California could come in as a free state, but the rest of the territory gained by the Mexican secession would be decided by popular sovereignty. So this is why it's really important that you understand the different areas that were gained in Western expansion from the last lesson. So here's California, and here is the Western territory gained in the Western secession. So all of this is going to be decided by something called popular sovereignty. And basically what that means is that these people, when they apply for statehood or admission to the Union, they're going to get to decide for themselves. They get to go to the ballot box and vote. And whatever the vote comes out to be, that's what the state would be. So no more 30 parallels, no more this state, that state. It's all going to be based upon the people and what they want. That's popular sovereignty. And that comes out of the Compromise of 1850. However, popular sovereignty did not work real well. We're going to see something called Bleeding Kansas, and it's over the admission of Kansas and Nebraska. And this is going to be the first time that popular sovereignty would be tested, and this is also going to overthrow the Missouri Compromise. So people who supported slavery and people who supported that free soil or the free states are going to flood into to Kansas and Nebraska. And Kansas and Nebraska is literally going to become a battleground with these free soilers and slave states, people who support slavery, flooding into Kansas and Nebraska and firing on each other, getting involved in brawls, even burning down some buildings. And that's why we call it Bleeding Kansas. Again, we want to focus on these free soilers because it becomes important because the Free Soil Party is going to become the party of Abraham Lincoln. So the Republican Party is going to take on these free soilers, these people that believe that slavery should not extend into more territory. Now, don't get free soilers confused with abolitionists. Abolitionists want slavery to be abolished and slavery to no longer exist. Free soilers, they just don't want slavery to expand into the new territories because it's a lot of maybe poor white people who don't want to compete with blacks for jobs. So it's really important not to get free soilers and abolitionists confused. Abraham Lincoln is going to be a Republican candidate, and the Republicans are taking in these free soilers, and that's important, and you need to remember that. We want to show that this issue over westward expansion and the entrance of slave state versus free state was not just some philosophical argument, stuffy people arguing it in Congress. It was very passionately felt by the different sides. And this picture illustrates an argument that erupted on the Senate floor between Charles Sumner, who was a senator, and he is going to denounce slavery, and he's going to do it in very vulgar terms, and he's ridiculing an elderly senator from South Carolina, Andrew Butler, and saying that the South Carolina senator's policies on slavery amount to raping virgins. And so it's really graphic, and this is all done on the Senate floor. Well, so Andrew Butler's cousin, Preston Brooks, is going to come, who's also a representative, is going to go to the Senate and basically start beating Sumner with a cane and almost beats him to death. So you can see that the tensions over slavery are really starting to get hot. You need to be familiar with a Supreme Court decision that is going to further divide the nation over slavery. That's the Dred Scott decision. The Dred Scott decision was a Supreme Court case that involved a slave named Dred Scott. His master is going to travel and is going to take him with him, and that includes going to free states. So when his master dies, he sues the wife for his freedom, saying that since he was taken into free territory, that he should then be free. The Supreme Court is going to rule against Dred Scott. They're going to say that he is property, so he's not a person, he's a slave and he's property, and the Constitution protects a person's right to property. So you can see that even the judicial branch is getting involved and making rulings, and with this decision, this is going to affect slave and free states, because this meant that if you could outlaw slavery anywhere, because the Constitution says that you cannot interfere with a person's right to property. So you can't outlaw slavery because it interferes with a person's right to property. So not the greatest moment for the Supreme Court, but you do need to be aware of the Dred Scott decision. The election of 1860 is going to be the straw that broke the camel's back, and that's going to come with the election of Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln is going to be elected as a Republican with a great deal of support from those free soilers, remember, who don't want the expansion of slavery. And when Abraham Lincoln is elected, that's going to set off a firestorm that it leads to the secession by South Carolina and other southern states. So his election leads them to make the decision to leave the Union. So when South Carolina decides to leave the Union or secede, it brings a bunch of other states with her, and that's going to be these states in green. They're all slaveholding states. There are going to be some states that come later. Those are going to be the ones that are this yellowish color. There are going to be some slaveholding states that do not join with South Carolina and don't secede. And then, of course, the white is going to be your Union. So we call the states that secede, we're going to call them the Confederacy. And the Confederacy is stating an old issue or bringing up an old issue of states' rights. And you need to be aware of this argument of states' rights. There is over slavery, but it's also over the right of a state to determine what it can do and the role of the federal government. The federal government cannot step in and tell a state that it can or cannot hold slaves because that affects its economy, right? The South is greatly dependent upon slave labor. So you do need to be aware of the states' right issue. What is the role of the government? Can the government come in and tell a state what it can and cannot do? So Abraham Lincoln is going to vow to preserve the Union and protect democracy. The Confederacy is formed, and the war is going to start when the Confederacy fires on Fort Sumter down in Charleston. So with the firing on Fort Sumter by the Confederacy, we're now headed into war. So we want to understand what are some of the strengths of the Union and what are some of the strengths of the South. What is their strategy going into this war? Well, the Union is going to have really good economic resources. They're going to have strong manufacturing. They have miles and miles of railroad. They have a really good navy. So they're not going to be dependent upon foreign powers or anybody to bring them in materials because they can produce them themselves. And that's going to be a huge advantage for them. They're also going to have really good leaders. Of course, Abraham Lincoln, he's going to be a strong leader and able to articulate what is the purpose of the war. And he's going to really be able to tell people that this is more than just slave versus not slave. This is about preserving the Union, and that's really important. So the South, their strength is going to be on their power of King Cotton, right? They did a lot of trading, and they have very strong trade relationships with Great Britain, and they need Great Britain's help to bring in their supplies because they don't have the manufacturing that the North did. And this is going to prove a problem when the Union blockades their ports. But that's sort of their plan. Their plan really is they've seceded from the Union. Their idea really is just to protect their borders and wait it out. And then the North would get tired of fighting, and then hopefully Great Britain and France will join them. Their idea is not to invade the North and bring everybody back together, but just to be a separate state, to be the Confederacy separate from the Union. They're also going to have really good military leaders. Robert E. Lee is going to be known as one of the great military leaders, and so he's very important in keeping the Southern cause alive. There are numerous battles in the Civil War, and the South Carolina end of course exam is only going to talk about these battles. So these are the battles that we're going to look at and really focus on. So don't get off on any rabbit trails on all the many battles that have occurred in the Civil War. These are the ones you really want to focus on. Of course, we've already talked about the bombing of Fort Sumter. It's going to be what started the war. They immediately, after they seceded, the Confederacy started taking over forts. And Fort Sumter sits out in the Charleston Harbor. If you've ever been down to Charleston, you can stand on the battery and look out, and you can see Fort Sumter. And Fort Sumter guarded the port coming into Charleston. And so they wanted the federal troops that were there to leave. And so once they fired on it, they basically put it under siege, and eventually those troops will leave. The other battle that you're going to need to know is the Battle of Bull Run, or First Manassas. A lot of Civil War battles have two names, but we're going to stick with the Battle of the Bull Run. This is going to be the first major battle of the Civil War. The armies are going to meet in Virginia. And as the armies meet and people start dying and the body count starts piling up, they sort of realize, oh, this is real. Because in the Civil War, there was sort of this attitude of, we'll whip the enemy in a week. And like the Union believed that it was going to be over in a month and everybody would be home and everybody would be back by fall or back by Christmas. And if you've ever seen the very famous movie Gone with the Wind, which is on war, there's this scene where they all rush off to war, but they're skipping off thinking, okay, we'll be back really soon. And I highly suggest if you want to watch, it's a long movie, but you should watch it because it gives you an idea about some of the time period. The Battle of Bull Run is where we're going to see Stonewall Jackson, and he's going to be standing firm against the Union Army. The Union Army is going to get pushed back, and it is considered a Southern victory. The other battle that you're going to need to know is the Battle of Antietam, and if you're in the South, it's called the Battle of Sharpsburg. But the Battle of Antietam is the bloodiest single day of the Civil War. In one day, 22,000 people are going to die in one day. This battle is actually not decided. It just ends in a draw. Neither side wins. It is going to be important because after this battle, it's going to force Abraham Lincoln to do something decisive. He needs to do something that will change the flow of the war. The Union's losing a lot of battles, and then with this crushing, not defeat, but loss of life, he needs to boost the morale and get things going back his way, and he's going to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. And the Emancipation Proclamation is issued after the Battle at Antietam, and it's a carefully crafted document. He doesn't want to upset the slave states that are still a part of the Union. So he made it so that it was about preserving the Union, not about freeing slaves. The Emancipation Proclamation is going to free those slaves that are in states that are rebelling. So he's freeing slaves in states that he doesn't really even control anymore. So it did not free all slaves, and that's important to note. This is going to, however, extremely help the war effort. It's going to help the war effort in two ways. One, the South is trying to, of course, allies get Great Britain to come in and help them, but Great Britain and France have abolished slavery. So with Lincoln freeing these slaves, it pushes Great Britain a little bit further away from the South. It's also going to be important because it meant that those slaves that are in the South are going to rise up, rebel, and flee to the North, and they're going to start forming their own army divisions, and they're going to join the Union Army and fight. So that's really important. So the freed slaves are going to fight for the Union, and once in the army, these freed slaves were not treated as equals. They are going to be in segregated units. They're not going to be officers. All the officers are white. They are going to receive less pay. Some of them are not going to be paid at all. But they fought very, very bravely, and they were motivated to fight because they were fighting for freedom. This was their fight. The most famous unit is going to be the 54th Regiment of Massachusetts Infantry. And this is a picture of a really unique picture. It shows the African American soldiers defeating the white Confederate soldiers, and there's a push and they were sort of like trying to bring the flag up to the top of this hill, and it was said that like the flag never touched the ground, and their heroism was noted, and this encouraged Lincoln to create more of these African American divisions. You need to know about the Battle of Vicksburg because the Battle of Vicksburg is considered the turning point in the war. And this is when the Union takes control of the Mississippi River. Lincoln saw the capture of Vicksburg as essential and key to winning the war, so it was really important to Lincoln. Once they got Vicksburg, it basically split the Confederacy in half, and so now they can't get their supplies down the Mississippi River, and that's going to be key in defeating the Confederacy. So the last battle that you need to know about, and it's considered the most important battle, of course, is the Battle of Gettysburg. It's going to be a huge amount of lives lost. The North is going to lose 23,000, and the South is going to lose 28. Of course, the Battle of Gettysburg is over several days, and months after this battle, Lincoln's going to do his famous Gettysburg Address, which you need to be familiar with. The Gettysburg Address was very short, and it said that he went to Gettysburg and he got up and he gave it, and people sort of blinked and and it was over before it even started. But it has become one of the most famous speeches, and it says, "67 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a large sense we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hollow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note or long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we are highly resolved that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. So you can see that this speech becomes absolutely critical in defining what the war was about. And that the people that had already died, that they should not be forgotten, and that what they died for not be in vain. And that it was about preserving something greater than an institution of slavery or freeing slaves, but it was about preserving the Union. And that's really important. Make sure that you're pretty familiar with that speech. You want to be familiar with Sherman and his march to the sea and his campaign in Atlanta. Led by Sherman, this was an effort to seize the very important city of Atlanta. So that's why it's called the Atlanta Campaign, because Atlanta had the railroad, and they had supplies. So it was really important to take Atlanta and disrupt the South supply chain. And once he succeeded in capturing Atlanta, he burned the city. So he's going to start something that's called total war. And in general, we think of wars, we think of armies fighting, supplies being moved around, and then maybe the people that are in between, the towns that are in between, may have the troops come through or something, but not total destruction. Sherman's going to say that we have it to involve everybody, that these people and their houses and their small farms are supporting the war effort, and it doesn't matter. So he begins, when he's leaving Atlanta and marching to the sea, he's going to Savannah, he's going to burn houses, pillage villages, and it's going to be very destructive. But his march is key in frightening soldiers and demoralizing the South, definitely disrupting any sort of chance of getting supplies, and it's effective in hastening the end of the war. When he gets to Savannah, he then makes a trip from Savannah up through Columbia, and he's on his way from Savannah to Charleston, and he goes through Columbia, and he's pillaging and burning. And if you've ever been to the State House, you can actually look at the State House, and they have these bronze stars that show where Sherman's cannons actually hit the Capitol building, and they burned a lot of Columbia. So the end of the war is going to come. The war is going to last 4 years. The South's dwindling economic resources because they didn't get the support from Great Britain or France. And then, of course, with Sherman's raid going through and destroying everything with his total war, you've got 640,000 Americans dead. You've got slaves fleeing and joining the North. General Lee, commander of the Confederates, is going to surrender at the Appomattox Courthouse. So the war is over, and we've looked at the key events that led to it, and then the battles that you need to know. But we're going to now look at how does the South rebuild, and what does the Union actually look like when we reintegrate the South. That is what we will head into in our next lesson. There's a lot of information on the Civil War. These are some of the better websites that I found. So if you want to look at them and use them as resources, you definitely can. And then, of course, my works cited page that I used mostly for finding pictures. They generally won't be of help to you, but if you wanted to look at the pictures, you could do that as well.